The fact that you've got these centrally planned features of the law, the fact that it goes back to a democratic Congress brings out how it is that these immigration regulations that strangle businesses are essentially just another aspect of the mixed economy, of the mixture between economic freedom and collectivist statism.
For every raid in a construction site, there is a business behind those workers that doesn't get to perform its job. Immigration is being discussed everywhere, and rightly so, given Trump's attacks on immigrants. And while it's very important to discuss and defend the rights of immigrants, as we have done many times on this podcast, it is also important to discuss the other right violations that happen when immigration is restricted and attacked. And those are the rights violations of Americans and particularly American businesses. And some of these violations, which far predate the Trump administration, is what will be discussed today. Welcome to the Ayn Rand Institute Podcast. I'm Agustina Vergara and I'm here with Ben Bayer. So I want to start by discussing the context in a broader context of what the immigration system does to American businesses. It's something that far predates the Trump administration, even though, because of the current crackdown on immigration, we see more of this crackdown on the news and everything, but it's something that has been going on for a long time. So essentially, the U.S. immigration system, in a very important way, is essentially central planning of labor, right? So the U.S. immigration system restricts the vast majority of peaceful people that want to come to America to work, and therefore the capacity of and the ability of businesses to hire those people. So it essentially tells businesses who they can hire, for how long they can hire them, and that pool of people that they are able to potentially hire is very, very small, because businesses can legally only hire people that fit into very narrow visa categories that the government itself defines. And it's not just that the visa categories are very narrow, but many of these visa categories have caps, meaning that only a very limited number of visas for each category are available and the government can give, regardless and completely separate from whatever need there is or however many employers a business wants to hire. So the demand has nothing to do with the caps that are allowed by the government. And there are many visas that potentially allow employees to come to America to work, but some of the main ones are, for instance, the one that is most popular is the H-1B visa, which is for specialty occupations that are defined by the government, and they require a formal degree, and these are the type of visas that a lot of people in Silicon Valley use for engineers and also healthcare people working in healthcare. Then we have the H-2B visa, which is for non-agricultural workers, like a seasonal visa for landscapers, construction workers, and hospitality. And there's also the H-2A visa, which is for temporary agricultural seasonal farm labor. Not all of these have caps, but like the H-1B, for instance, and the H-2B have caps. And the truth is that the vast majority of the potential employees that business would want to hire don't fit into these categories or can't get a visa because of the caps. So, for instance, if the business wants to hire they somehow find, say, in India, right? Like they find a genius young person who is an AI genius, right? And they know how to build AI tools and models and everything. And this person does not have a formal degree because, let's say, it's self-taught, or has a degree that is unrelated to software engineer. There is no way for businesses to hire this person. So because he would not fit into any of these categories that the government imposes on businesses. So to come to work in America, this young person would have a better chance if they marry a U.S. citizen and then come through a family sponsorship, or if they somehow are able to claim asylum, then they will be able to come to America in a much more straightforward way than they would if they actually wanted to come here to work and be productive.
Yeah, Augustina, you mentioned at the top that this is a central planning approach to the international labor market, and uh, you're right on about that. And if this kind of policy were adopted for business and industry, generally speaking, as in not specified to immigrants, but if the U.S. government said no, certain kinds of industries can only hire certain categories of people in certain amounts in an unrestricted way. If they said, technology companies can only hire so many software programmers, and farm agriculture industries can only hire so many planters and field hands, etc. If it were unrestricted in that way, it would be obvious to everybody that this was a kind of neo-Marxist plot by the government to try to run the economy. And for some reason, the fact that it's dealing with immigrant labor somehow blinds people to the fact that this is exactly what it is. And we're going to talk more today, evidence that this is exactly what it is, especially given the fact that some of the best employees that you can find are outside of this country. That is, that our education system simply does not prepare enough people, for lots of reasons, to be able to serve the needs of industry. And so by restricting immigrant labor to the categories and caps that you mentioned, it is in effect government is trying to control and plan the economy centrally. And I spent some time looking over section 1153 of the US Code, which lays down some of the kinds of caps and requirements that you talked about. And I'll have other things to say about it later today, but a couple of things just now that popped out to me of note here that I think really underscore how this is a kind of central planning are the following two things. One, this prioritization that it gives to family connections over actual ability to do work, that there's a much higher cap for the number of people who are allowed in based on being married or having some other kind of close family ties to someone who's a citizen. And that's maybe not an attempt to plan the economy per se, but it is certainly a restriction on the economy when you think about it, that reflects other policy agendas and priorities of whoever it was that set this policy. I mean, think about it this way. How would you explain to somebody who had the skills that some American business needed, who wanted to come here, contribute to the productiveness of the economy, but because of these caps, they get excluded in favor of some shiftless relative who, let's say, doesn't have any interest in working, but wants to sit around their relative's house all day? How do you explain to that person why the first person, why they don't get to come in, but the shiftless relative does? It's an arbitrary dictate by a government bureaucrat that is set up to maybe please the family values crowd or something, but no other reason. Or a second example is, you mentioned the way that you mentioned specialty professions that are allowed by the H-1B visa. There's also in Section 1153 a prioritization given for workers of extraordinary ability. And I mean, extraordinary ability sounds great. We should have lots of people with extraordinary ability. But the particular way that this section of the US Code defines extraordinary ability is basically if you can document that you've impressed some foreign bureaucrats with your ability, that you've got the necessary academic degrees or awards that check some boxes according to a foreign government, which we're then taking as relevant and sufficient authority for our government to allow you to come in. And you can be a professor who studies some obscure field, who's given some kind of certificate by a foreign government, and you get prioritized over, let's say, productive business workers who could really contribute to the economy. But because you've checked foreign bureaucrats' boxes, therefore you get priority according to our governments. So it's a complete central planning approach. And other things we'll talk about today, I think, will bring that out.
Like I said earlier, many of these visas have caps, right? And one of the many issues with the caps is that the demand for these visas far exceed the availability of these of the number of these visas that the government gives out every day. So the H-1B visa, for instance, that is a notorious one because it has like 65,000 visas that are available, and then 20,000 more for workers with a U.S. degree. But then the demand is close to, or some years over 500,000 visas. So a lot of workers, are not able to come, and those businesses, cannot possibly meet the workforce needs through this visa. Same is true with the H-2B visa, but this one sometimes government gives like a few more visas to meet the demand, but the demand really far exceeds the statutory cap of 66,000 visas every year. So it's really hard for a business to reliably plan for their workforce, and it's really hard for them to be able to get the employees that they actually need to be productive and to meet their goals, right? So I think one example here that it's important to mention is the process to hire an H-1B worker. So the H-1B visa, like we had discussed earlier, is this visa for specialty occupations, and I think it's just the whole process is really, I think it can be defined as Kafkaesque. It's really, really complicated. It's expensive, and it really highlights the way in which employers have to, bend over backwards to just be able to hire a talented person that they wish to incorporate to the workforce and have them come here to America. So just finding, as anyone that has ever hired a person, foreign or native born, they know that finding a good worker is already so hard to do. And there's a lot that goes into recruitment and seeing if this person is going to be the right fit for this company and this team and all of that, right? So that is really hard to do. But then if you add this expensive and bureaucratic process that the H-1B visa requires employers to do, that becomes even way more complicated. And it's actually, the recruitment efforts from companies are really unlikely to succeed because of the limited numbers of visas that are available. So part of what employers have to do is they have to prove that hiring that specific foreign worker won't somehow negatively impact the working conditions for U.S. workers. And then for each employee that they want to hire from abroad, approximately, it's really expensive to do that. So on top of every other cost, they have to pay, I saw an estimate of about $8,000 for each employee between, application fees, lawyer fees, because the system is incredibly convoluted and complicated, and most companies need immigration lawyers to go through that process. And then there's the admin overhead and everything, all the time that people have to dedicate in the company to each and every single employee that they want to hire from abroad. But I think one of the most offensive parts of this is that once they submit their application and there's like some process there that, weeds through some of the applications for eligibility, then these applications go through a lottery system, which means that it is literally left to chance what employees, what prospective employees, what applicants are going to actually get a visa. So this makes workforce planning for the businesses incredibly unreliable because, their hiring decisions have to depend on a literal lottery. It's random rather than, careful planning and, thoughtful planning of what the company needs for the future and how many employees and who. And it kind of makes a mockery of the recruitment process that the employer went through. And it also makes a mockery of the individual employee because it's essentially saying all of the employees here or of the potential of the applicants are fungible, right? It doesn't matter if you get John or if you get Heather. Like, it's just the same. We're just going to put them all in a random lottery, treat them all as the same, and then we're going to, give the employer just a random selected one. So I think I see it just as incredibly offensive to the employer, to the employee, and it makes a mockery of of planning and careful processes that go into the long range thinking that businesses have to engage with.
And you and I did a podcast a few months ago, Agustina, on the aspects of the DOGE program, the Department of Government Efficiency, where we talked about some cuts it was making to foreign aid, where we thought, yeah, this is actually not a bad idea to make these kinds of cuts. And generally, DOGE has been sold on the idea of making things more efficient, not just in government, but for businesses who face red tape in certain cases. Well, if you care about that, if you think it's important to cut red tape because you think that the regulatory burden of so many different laws and regulations makes it difficult for people to do business, well, think more about how these kinds of immigration restrictions do that to business people too. Because what is more important to a business than the talent that you hire to help do business with? And anybody who runs a business knows that hiring is one of the most difficult things they do. And this just puts up so many extra barricades to their being able to do their job and to keep their business running and to make a profit. So I should stress, and you've been stressing all throughout, Agustina, that the characteristics of the immigration system that we've been talking about so far, none of this is new to the Trump administration. We're talking about features that go back years and years that right now nobody's bothering to challenge. And by the way, the bulk of the immigration restrictions we're talking about go back to 1952, which was a system of laws passed by a Democratic Congress, Democratic in both the Senate and the House. And you can see that reflected in the kind of central planning aspects of this regime that we're talking about. And nobody is currently working on challenging that. It's notable, the more recent update to the immigration laws was made in 1990. And the caps that you mentioned, the ones where the demand for the workers far exceed the supply that's allowed because of these caps, those caps were set in 1990. The worldwide cap of employment-based visas is 140,000 workers. Companies are allowed to hire 140,000 workers a year, I believe. And so that's an extraordinarily low number. And I mean, do you think there's been any growth in demand for labor since 1990, basically 35 years ago? Of course there's been. And yet, so the reason that there's this outpacing of demand for supply is that, as with any kind of centrally planned scheme, the laws and the text of the laws does not keep up with economic reality unless the law is changed. And of course, nobody's been willing to change that law. And so what this brings out, the fact that you've got these centrally planned features of the law, the fact that it goes back to a Democratic Congress that was basically working from statist collectivist premises, really brings out how it is that these immigration regulations that strangle businesses are essentially just another aspect of the mixed economy, of the mixture between economic freedom and collectivist statism that has been gradually leaning in favor of statism and collectivism, since the 1930s. And I mean, you see that it's very clear when you compare that to other aspects of the system that the Trump administration has not only failed to challenge, but which has doubled down on. So you see that especially with the tariff system. Everybody knows that tariffs are essentially kind of protectionism for domestic industries. Domestic industries lobby for this protection. They don't want to have to compete with more efficient foreign competitors. And so because we lived in a mixed economy where every interest group forms a pressure group and lobbies for certain kinds of forced sacrifices on behalf of other members of the economy, well, this is just another example of that. Everybody knows this is an example with tariffs. But it's the same thing when you look at labor regulations. In effect, the reason that we've had these numbers capped since 1990, set to 1990 levels, is to keep the number of foreign employees, of immigrant employees, artificially low, and thereby to artificially raise the wage levels for American-born workers. And to the extent that there's ever any change in those quotas through the years, it's only because some other industry that maybe needs immigrant employees for one reason or another is able to get some lobbying done of its own and then pressure the government to carve out some exception for it. And we'll talk a little bit more about those later. But this whole system is a product of what Ayn Rand called the pressure group warfare of the mixed economy, where different competing interest groups will compete over the legal right to sacrifice other groups to themselves. And of course, it's a constant struggle because there's different groups that gain power at different times, and then that leaves an artifact in the form of all kinds of carve-outs and exceptions in the actual US code. And when people normally look at this kind of behavior, especially on the left, what they tend to do is to say, oh, it's all the people to blame are the plutocrats, the businesses that are trying to run our government. But of course, the only reason anyone ever needs to try to get these exceptions to the regulatory apparatus is because the government, in the first place, has this stranglehold over the economy by which it can dispense favors. And so the solution to this is not to go and blame the businesses who are basically trying to work within the system that's been imposed on them. The solution is to free up the system, to take away the power that government has to dispense permissions like this, and therefore to obviate, if you take away that power, you obviate the need for interest groups to go to lobby government to try to carve out some kind of sphere of protection for itself. I mean, if you didn't have, just as one example, if you didn't have thousands of other labor regulations that are put on companies in the first place that make it more expensive for them to do business, regulations on labor negotiation and safety and environmental quality, et cetera, you wouldn't make domestic labor so expensive that certain kinds of industries then need to go to government and try to lobby for certain kinds of special permissions to hire cheaper foreign labor that they will sometimes allow when the industry has enough pull.
We should clarify, Ben, that the 140,000 number is for employment-based green cards, not temporary visas. But this is important because the H-1B, the H-2B, those are temporary. So if a company wants to secure that employee for more than, in the case of the H-1B, for more than 6 years, they need to apply for their green card. So it matters that the employee visa, the employee green card pool is only 140,000, which sometimes when family-based green cards go unused, that they add those to the employment-based green cards, but it's still a ridiculously low number for employment-based green cards. Again, you have a much bigger chance of immigrating to America legally by marrying an American citizen, for instance, than to come here, on your own and just apply through work. And we would also be remiss if we didn't mention the fact that many employers end up hiring illegal immigrants. And I think this is in part because, employers are kind of forced to hire people under the table if they want to meet their labor wants and needs, particularly in industries like agriculture and construction, because in some of these industries, there's literally such a small number of Americans that are willing to do these jobs that if a company or if a business wants to continue operating and they need employees, they have no choice but to go to the labor black market and hire illegal immigrants. Last year, I got the chance to talk to a farmer from South Carolina who said that he hires through a legal process in this case, but he can't hire that many through a legal process, so he has a lot of trouble with his workforce. He said that when he puts ads out, every year there's the 3 same American people that apply to jobs in a farm. It's like 3 people. And he told me that whenever he gets the chance to hire other people, they last about a week and then they stop showing up to work. It seems like really a lot of Americans just don't want to do this sort of job, and he has to rely. In this case, he was relying on a visa, but you can understand, like on hiring, I mean, employees through a visa, but it's such a limited number that he can hire, and you can understand how other employers may face the need to hire illegal workers to meet the demand of their businesses, because there is no way that they can get the employees that they need in any other way. So that's how I think part of the reason why employers end up hiring under the table. And I think we also need to mention the fact that because there is this restriction, part of what I think the vast majority of employers are well-intentioned people that just want to trade, right? But when you introduce government in these sort of relationships between employer and employee, and you introduce the force of government, what happens is that there are some employers that are bad actors, and that they use the fact that a person may be here in America illegally, to coerce the employee and tell them, for instance, like, if you don't do what I say, I'm going to call ICE on you. And you're threatening to use the force of government to, get them to do what they want, or whatever sort of extortion may be going on there. I think this is a minority of cases, but it can actually happen because government is wielding this arbitrary and, illegitimate power over, these immigrants that are just here trying to work.
And that last point you mentioned about the ability to threaten to call ICE is something that now under the Trump administration is more salient and real of a threat than ever. And so far we've just been talking about problems with the existing immigration system, but I think this is a good opportunity to segue to what's new now with Trump policies and how they are doubling down in the threat not only to immigrants, but thereby also to American businesses.
Yes, I think we've seen lately so many reports of the raids that ICE has been carrying out across the country. Particularly in the last few weeks, we've seen a lot of footage from California specifically, and you see how ICE goes specifically to workplaces to round up immigrants and pick them up and take them away. So there's many instances of this. There was a raid in El Cajon in Southern California recently, where they raided a paint shop and they took away a lot of employees, and charged the owner with with harboring illegal immigrants and things like that. And then we've seen ICE showing up to Home Depot in Los Angeles, to restaurants, to car wash places, just places where immigrants are likely to be working or seeking work. I think it is especially despicable to do that. And if you see the footage, there is footage from a ICE raid at a construction site that I think was in Florida, where you see the ICE agents, there's 5-10 ICE agents, and they're rounding up, 50 construction workers or something like that, who are just standing there waiting for ICE to come up to each individual, one of them, and then, saying papers, please, prove to me that you're here legally. Just, peacefully, essentially submitting themselves to the ICE agents, right? And also, they're trying to tell us that these people that are just, the photos are just them all lined up in a construction site with their helmets on because they were working, just waiting for ICE to the agent to come to them and ask them questions. Those are the criminal, violent immigrants that we're trying to kick out to make our community safer. I don't think so. I think the vast majority of these people are peaceful workers that are working, and businesses are employing them to just produce, and these are the people that they're trying to say, these are criminals and we're being invaded and that sort of thing.
Yeah, the fact that they have to follow Stephen Miller's idea of just doing worksite raids because the numbers that they were picking up of actual illegal immigrants were too low. They wanted to be deporting more. And so they said, well, where are we going to find a lot of illegal immigrants? Well, let's just go to the work sites. The fact that that's the strategy they pivoted toward really gives the lie to the idea that the reason we're doing this crackdown is because there's an invasion of people who are threatening our national security, or because they want to be welfare state freeloaders. I mean, you don't go to work sites to crack down on welfare state freeloaders. And so it reminds me, Agustina, of there's a trope that's used by the anti-immigration crowd whenever you see reports of people escaping over the border to come into this country. And they'll say it's military-aged men, which is a description they're using to try to conjure up the fear that these are terrorists or some other kinds of violent threats. But what that really means is that they are of able-bodied age to work. And that's why they are of an age they could be a soldier. Nobody wants to be a soldier at this age. What they want to do is work. And so their own propaganda and now their own decision to pivot to targeting work sites, I think, really brings out the fact that these are not for the most part freeloaders who are trying to get into this country.
Yes, I think that is true. And I think there's the raids and that sort of immigration enforcement that is going on. I think that is one way to attack the businesses, via attacking the workers. And part of the reason is that, there's this chilling effect of raids, which is proven time and time again that it happens, and it's absolutely logical that it happens, which is, even if someone is not picked up in a raid, they are going to be scared of showing up to work, to their workplaces. And I think that is true even if a person is here legally, because they are scared of, what if I show up to work and I get rounded up and, deported, not just deported, but we've seen the violence that ICE agents are using and how they beat people up when they apprehend them. So I think it's a reasonable thing that, employees are stopped showing up to work and businesses are gravely affected by that. But another way that this crackdown on immigration is currently impacting businesses is that the Trump administration is ending the legal status for hundreds of thousands of people that were here legally. So this is the case of Trump ending TPS, temporary protected status, for certain nationalities like the Venezuelans, and the humanitarian parole programs for Cuban, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans that Biden created. Now, people might disagree with the fact of that Biden did this enacted not TPS, but like this sponsorship, a humanitarian parole, without Congress. Like, there's a lot of complaints that people have about that. But the truth is that these people came here legally, and they were vetted, and they were screened, and they were permitted to come here to work, and now their status are being terminated. And when the status of these people are terminated, it means that they're no longer legally allowed to work. And if they haven't procured any other status during their stay, they become deportable. So what happens is that businesses are forced to fire them or put them on leave because they are no longer legal workers. And a lot of companies cannot, because of the consequences, are not willing to hire illegal workers. So there's an example, I think, this is just one example, but I think it's telling. Disney had to put 45 Venezuelan employees on leave because their legal status was terminated under the Trump administration. So you might think, okay, 45 Venezuelans in Disney, okay, big deal. But imagine this playing out across the country and across many industries for hundreds of thousands of workers that have had their status terminated. I think it is a huge hit to businesses. They're like all overnight, their workers are no longer legal. And
I think this is an important example to think about when you hear the occasional outcry from Trump or from his supporters criticizing the Chavista socialist regime of Venezuela. Can you really take seriously that they are opponents of socialism when you know the following two things? One is, as we've already been discussing, that they don't seem to have any problem with trying to centrally plan in a Marxist fashion the labor market of our own country, which is what these immigration restrictions represent, and along with the various trade restrictions that are now being imposed. But second, on top of that, as if that wasn't bad enough, now when you have actual refugees from foreign socialist countries like Venezuela, which these people want to criticize for being a foreign Marxist regime, well, we're not going to actually try to help them escape that place. That is, if they themselves are opponents of Venezuelan socialism and they are trying to seek refuge in a free country or allegedly free country like the United States, we are not going to let them in, even though they, more than many Americans, are obviously rejecting and rebelling against Venezuelan socialism. So in what sense is the Trump administration here actually expressing any kind of opposition to socialism, if it's okay with central planning at home and not even allowing refugees from socialist countries like Venezuela in? I just don't see the sense. And maybe that's why Cuban Republican members of Congress like Maria Elvira Salazar from Florida's 27th, who had been a supporter of President Trump, has now recently expressed second thoughts, saying this isn't what we voted for, when she sees the crackdowns and the mass deportations of immigrants, including ones from Venezuela, perhaps even some from Cuba, for all we know. So it's a really insincere objection for anyone in this administration now to complain about Chavistas in Venezuela.
Another way in which the Trump administration is attacking businesses through immigration is that the way that the Trump administration has attacked student visas. So this is we could have like a really long discussion about the ins and outs of this, but essentially what the listener needs to know about this is that recently, I think starting around March or April, there was an effort by the government to revoke the visas, the legal status of students that are here on student visas, right? It's called the F1 visa for the most part. So essentially it's people that, are foreigners and got accepted into universities here, and now, and they have paid tuition or whatever arrangements, and now they were studying here in the United States, and all of a sudden, overnight, their status was terminated. I had the chance to speak with some of the lawyers bringing lawsuits against the Trump administration over this, and I heard that the termination, what they allege, is absolutely arbitrary. Details, we don't have time to discuss the details here, but so the student visas are already very regulated and very prohibitive. Only a tiny minority of people can access those visas for several reasons. Way before Trump, this has always been true of the student visas. But the truth is that these student visas tend to bring in, a lot of people with different knowledge, different contexts that businesses find really attractive. And businesses actually recruit international students from universities, because what happens with a student visa is that for the most part, after a student finishes their degree, they get 1 year to work on a field related on a company, on a job related to their field of study. So that's why companies from Apple to Google to, banks and finance firms and everything in between, they recruit from these universities to bring in this talent. And then after that, they can try to sponsor them for a visa. So when you attack the student visas, what you're really doing in the long term is attacking the business's possibility to hire the talent that they want that comes from abroad through those visas. So I think that especially not just with the visas that were terminated for individual students, but also the attack, for instance, on Harvard and their capacity to enroll foreign students. I think that we're going to see in the long term, in a couple of years at the latest, we're going to see how companies are actually very, very much affected by not being able to recruit that people anymore, or like the diminishing numbers of people coming in for student visas are definitely going to impact the businesses that really want to hire them.
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion when we talk about trade policy in particular of what does American industry need to be competitive with other industries abroad, and it's a conversation that for the most part happens on a kind of collectivist level, where you think, well, this is an American industry as a whole is what is the relevant standard. But if you bracket that for a moment and think about, well, what are actually some of the most competitive American industries, not versus other countries, but just if you look at the objective success of the industry. One is the tech industry, which thrives and to the extent I think that it's able to draw the best minds from around the world. But another one is higher education. Like, one of our best exports is graduates from our universities. Even though our K through 12 system is less than impressive, our higher education system is a lot better. But now we are even in a number of ways cutting off its ability to bring the best students and therefore feed those extremely successful industries at home. But to take a step back from that for a moment, I also want to point out that the fact that student visas exist as a special category, as much as it's good for people to be able to come study in America, contribute to American industry, take their knowledge with them, export it abroad, as much as that's good generally speaking, the fact that there's a special carve-out for student visas is itself another aspect of the central planning aspect of the existing immigration system that nobody's willing to challenge. And while it has certain benefits in certain cases, like especially you can think of in STEM fields, the student visa system doesn't specify which field you have to be in order to get a student visa. And so somebody can also have, be planning to study some obscure field like gender studies or underwater basket weaving in the United States, and get a student visa when somebody who actually wanted to come here and do something actually productive doesn't get the special privilege that comes from that. And so, like, you can't get a student visa to come and study objectivism with the Ayn Rand Institute because we're not an official accredited government-approved institution at this point. And so we can't do that. But anybody else can do it as long as they've got the right government certifications. So it's another aspect of the central planning dimension of the immigration system. But yeah, bracketing the question of whether there should be special carve-outs for students, it is especially bizarre that you would want to somehow try to limit and inhibit the ability to find the best minds, especially in fields like STEM, where we need their knowledge and their talent and their expertise. That is, American businesses need their talent and expertise if they want to be successful.
And I will say to, I guess not to his credit anymore, but like before, when Donald Trump was campaigning last year, he went on the record on a podcast to say he was asked about student visas, and what he said was that he thought that a green card should come attached with every single degree from an American university. And I can say, I mean, again, leaving aside that the entire system needs to be rethought, I thought that was actually a good idea. But then what we're seeing from the administration now, it's exactly the opposite of that. It's closing America off more, letting fewer and fewer students come in, as opposed to what Trump said he wanted to do back then. But like you said, Ben, just a moment ago, is that this is, like you mentioned, the tech industry being impacted severely by this. But I think basically every single industry that employs immigrants, which is basically all industries, are going to be so impacted by this and are currently already in the system, pre-Trump administration, already so severely impacted. One of them is the construction industry. There's already so like a shortage of workers to work in this industry. The fact that these raids are taking place, it's making the situation worse because a lot of the workers that work in this industry tend to be illegal immigrants, and overall about 30% is estimated of the nationwide workforce for construction is immigrant, illegal or not. So I think that we're going to start seeing a really bad effect on essentially every single industry that has a high percentage of immigrant workers. And one thing is, like I said at the outset, it's really important to discuss the rights of immigrants in this context. But it's also important to think about the fact that for every for every raid in a construction site, there is a business behind those workers that doesn't get to perform its job, right, like to deliver to their clients. There's, for instance, in the construction industry, there's all the houses that will go unbuilt, the roofs that will go unrepaired, the individual Americans that are not going to be able to procure these services or not do so in a timely manner because businesses can't hire the workers that they need to do the bare minimum to provide services to those businesses. And I think that is usually an underappreciated aspect of restrictions on immigration and the sort of enforcement that we're seeing right now on immigration.
Yeah, you mentioned the way in which an industry like construction in particular is going to be impacted by these policies, because it just so happens that construction industry draws a lot of its workers from overseas. And that's also true of industries like agriculture, hospitality, and restaurants. And those three industries were recently the subject of controversy because President Trump decided to muse on Truth Social about giving exemptions, special exemptions for farms, hotels, and restaurants. I'll read to you the text of his tweet here. He says, "Our great farmers and people in the hotel and leisure business have been stating that our very aggressive policy on immigration is taking very good long-time workers away from them, with those jobs being almost impossible to replace." And then he says there will be changes coming. Who would have guessed that your very aggressive policy on immigration would take away workers from industries that really need them? It's almost like it was something that people warned about in advance. So of course, it's a natural consequence of targeting the workplaces in the way that he decided to do. And yeah, he said changes would be coming. It sounded like he was going to give out an exemption. Guidance actually went out from the White House for a brief period of time that there would be this exemption. But then forces from within the administration intervened to stop that. I'll mention that in a minute, but it's worth commenting on how, thinking about the dynamics that would have gone into this, at least consideration of an exemption in the first place. And clearly what's happening is people from these industries are calling up Trump and trying to lobby for more exemptions on their behalf. And he obviously has a base of support among the business community, and so they are reaching out to him. But this is just that same pressure group warfare of the mixed economy in action. And except they're trying to do it extra legally in ways that haven't yet been encoded into the law yet. So when you look at the actual written immigration code, you see all of these carve-outs that are the result of various lobbying efforts that actually made it into Congress. But here they're just doing the preliminary to that, which is that the law has been passed, the law has been written, it's obviously arbitrary, and it's affecting them in arbitrary ways, making it impossible for them to do business. And so they try to find their buddies in power who will cut them a break and try to exercise some discretion in how these laws get enforced. And of course, it's highly problematic because it is completely contrary to the rule of law. It's completely arbitrary and non-objective, and it shows how the mixed economy and the pressure group warfare that it involves amounts to a kind of rule by dictate, except it's not necessarily one dictator, it's dozens and dozens of them all competing for power. And so that's a window into the nature of the mixed economy and how it works. But then, of course, this was actually walked back, in particular by the Department of Homeland Security leadership, not apparently out of any kind of concern for rule of law, but because it would mean that Stephen Miller wouldn't get to keep his number of arrests and deportations up. And so the the assault continues. So when Trump walked this back, well, he didn't really come out and walk it back. What he did was to post again saying we will continue to expand our efforts to detain and deport illegal aliens. That walked it back by implication, but he did it in a clever way, because if you read the rest of that Truth Social post, what he does say is we're going to focus on Democratic-run cities. And so if you ask me, if I read between the lines, what I see there is I'm still going to exercise arbitrary discretion, because by focusing on the cities, you're thereby not focusing on rural areas. And thereby you still get to cut at least the ag workers a break, because you're trying to cut a break for your friends in the ag industry, base of your support in red states. They also happen to supply a lot of the food that we all eat. And so it's, I think in the end, even though that original exemptions walk back, still a backdoor way to embracing a completely arbitrary, lawless approach to the enforcement of these laws.
And I think it's really important to note that being pro-business means being pro-freedom to hire and trade. Because ultimately what immigration is trade, is, allowing people to come here to trade and, and work for American businesses. So I think that it's really like this immigration agenda and all regulations predating Trump, like we have been discussing, in the U.S. immigration system are essentially anti-trade. And that's important because so-called defenders of freedom and the free markets and people who say they're allegedly pro-business but are anti-immigration, they're really not pro-businesses, because they don't agree with the fact that businesses have freedom to trade, should have their freedom to trade respected, and to hire whoever they want. But like I was saying, what's happening right now with Trump is only possible because we have this immigration system that is, central planning of the workforce, and it does not respect the rights of business people to hire. And yes, it's worse under Trump because we are seeing this enforcement, but it's always been bad. And deportations and deportation agendas like under the Obama administration have been impacting businesses for many, many years. The legal immigration system and the temporary visa system for workers is really, really bad. We touched on that earlier. And I think that you were saying, Ben, that almost nobody's really challenging the core of the system. And when I hear about it, well, we need immigration reform and whatnot, I think we don't need immigration reform. We need to rethink the immigration system entirely to, get rid of this anti-trade, anti-work premise that is crippling, the immigrants that have a right to move, but also the businesses, the American businesses and their clients, right? The American businesses who have a right to hire whoever they want, whoever they see fit for the jobs that they want to do.
Yeah, it's you said that this is essentially about free trade, that the opposition to free immigration essentially comes from an opposition to free trade, because free trade is trade in labor, just like international trade is free trade in goods, in the exchange of imports and exports. Ayn Rand thought that free trade was essentially the foreign policy of capitalism. She was an advocate of laissez-faire capitalism, and she's on record saying, and I recently wrote an article about this, that what her defense of capitalism means, even in a world where you're faced with other countries that are unfree, is nonetheless leadership on the issue of free trade. And that's, of course, perfectly logical. That should be the foreign policy of capitalism, because free trade is also the domestic policy of capitalism. The whole idea that we should have a separation between state and economy in just the same way that we should have a separation of state and church. That's essentially the endorsement of free trade at home, because it means ending regulations, ending redistribution schemes, ending different forms of taxation, and allowing for there to be free trade among adults who live in the country. And yet that is now being lost sight of. For the longest time, it was lost sight of by the left, by the Democrats, the so-called progressives. They traditionally, at least for the last 100 years or so, more than that, have wanted to fragment the concept of individual freedom, to break it up into the kinds of freedoms that you should be allowed, but then to sweep away the ones that you shouldn't. And so they'll say, well, you should have freedom with regard to your private, personal life, with regard to the way you engage in intellectual matters, but you shouldn't have any kind of freedom with regard to your public life, which they usually construe to mean your economic life. You shouldn't have, as a businessman, the freedom or the right to trade, even with people in your own country. You should be subjected to regulations and taxations and redistribution schemes. And this goes back all the way to the end of the Lochner era in the United States Supreme Court. And the right, the conservatives, have not been much better. They've said, no, you should have freedom with regard to your economic life, not with regard to your personal life. Now they have gotten to the point of fragmenting that remainder of freedom that they had advocated even further, which is to say, well, you should have economic freedom, but only in many cases domestically and not internationally. And even on the domestic front, it's been shrinking in various ways, given the way that, given the new taste that the Republican administration has for antitrust law and for corporate taxation, among other things. But the fact is that freedom, in fact, forms a unity, that the American value of individual freedom is something that should not be fragmented in this way, that it applies across all spheres of life. Our need for freedom, if we are to live successfully as human beings and to pursue happiness. And it's a right we all have, and it's a right the government should protect. And I should mention, just incidentally, that it's also the best way, freedom is the best weapon for dealing with international threats to freedom. And always has been. It's why we won wars against totalitarian regimes to the extent that we were free to produce at home. It's why the North won the Civil War against the South, and should apply equally to the logic of dealing with various international threats today. So worried today about socialism in Venezuela? Well, how about you allow its refugees to come to this country? You deprive its system of victims, deprive them of minds, of workers. You let them come here. You let them contribute to our system. Worried about a Chinese military buildup? Well, why don't you use the best STEM workers from China to build up our military? Of course, you can have justified restrictions on the freedom of trade. When you are in a wartime situation, you don't have free trade with your enemy. This is why, Israel shouldn't have open borders or, free travel and trade, with Iran right now. But we are expressly not in the same situation with regard to Mexico or Guatemala as Israel is with regard to Iran. We are in peacetime situation with relation to most of Latin America. That's where most of the immigrants are coming from. And the attempt to turn this into the view that there's a national security threat from people who are coming here peacefully to work and to contribute to the productiveness of our economy is just one of the biggest con jobs that politicians have tried to sell the American public in the last 20 years.
So with that, we're going to draw a line on today's episode, and I just want to recommend to our audience some resources that they may want to look at to learn more about what we discussed today. First, there's an article that I wrote recently in June 2025 called Immigration Regulations Strangle American Businesses, and the audience can find it in our New Ideal journal. There's also my talk that I gave in the Objectivist Summer Conference in 2023 called The Immorality of the U.S. Immigration System, where I discuss this anti-work premise that is built into our immigration system. And then there's Ben's article, Ayn Rand on Free Trade, The Essence of Capitalism Foreign Policy, from May 2025. And as usual, please subscribe, comment on this video or wherever you're watching it, and share on YouTube and everywhere else. And you can send us comments and questions to newideal@aynrand.org. Thank you so much, and see you all next week.